96. The Great Depression. Collapse of the world economy. The European economy, like the economies in all other regions of the world, was deeply entangled in a global system of trade and production because many basic commodities prices were determined by the free play of supply and demand in a worldwide market. There was much regional division of labor. Large areas lived by producing a few specialized articles for sale to the world as a whole. A great deal of production, both local and international, especially in the 1920s, was financed by credit, that is, by promises of repayment in the future. The system rested upon mutual confidence in the processes of mutual exchange, on the belief of lenders, creditors, and investors that they would get their money back, and on the belief of borrowers that they could pay their debts. This vast interlocking system also depended on the ability of farms and factories to market their products at prices high enough to bring a net return, so that farmers and factory people might purchase the output of other factories and farms. All this round and round in countless circles of mutual interdependence and throughout the world as a whole. The prosperity of the 1920s and its weaknesses. The 5 years after 1924 were a period of prosperity in that there was an expansion of international trade, building, and new industries. The automobile, for example, still in very limited use before 1914, became an 1431 article of mass production after the war. Its widespread use increased the demand for oil, steel, rubber, and electrical equipment, caused the building of tens of thousands of miles of roads, and created whole new occupations for truck drivers, garage mechanics, and gas station attendants. Similarly, the new mass popularity of radios and movies had repercussions in all directions. The economic expansion was most phenomenal in the United States, but almost all European countries enjoyed it in greater or lesser degree. Prosperity became a magical term, and some thought that it would last indefinitely, that the secret of human plenty and of progress had been found, and that science and invention were at last realizing the hopes of ages. But there were weaknesses in this prosperity, various imperfections in this or that gear or valve of the mechanism, flaws that, under stress, were to bring the whole intricate structure to a halt. The expansion was largely financed by credit or borrowing. Laboring people received less than a proportionate share. Wages lagged behind profits and dividends. Mass purchasing power, even when inflated by installment buying, another form of credit, was inadequate to pay for the vast output that it was technically possible to produce. And throughout the world, the whole decade of the 1920s was a time of chronic agricultural depression, so that farmers could neither pay their debts nor purchase manufactures to the degree required for the smooth functioning of the system. A prosperity financed by credit, 8115 1432 movies became one of the most popular entertainments in European cities during the early 20th century. This crowd was waiting to enter London's Brixton Astoria Theatre in December 1930. Similar movie theaters attracted large audiences throughout Europe, even amid the economic crisis of the Great Depression. Fox Photos, Hulton Archive, Getty Images. Military operations in the First World War had reduced wheat fields under cultivation in Europe by a fifth. The world price of wheat went up, and farmers in the United States, Canada, and elsewhere increased their acreage. Often, to acquire land at high prices, they assumed mortgages that in later years they were unable to repay. After the war, Europe restored its wheat production, and Eastern Europe re-entered the world market. Agriculture everywhere was increasingly mechanized. Farmers rapidly increased their output of wheat by using a tractor-drawn harvester thresher combine, and scientific research helped to increase the yield per acre. The result of all these agricultural developments was a superabundant global output of wheat. But the demand for wheat was what economists call inelastic. By and large, within the area of Europe and the wider Western world, people already ate as much bread as they wanted and would buy no more. And the undernourished masses of Asia, 1433, who in pure theory could have consumed the excess, could not pay even low costs of production or transportation. The price of wheat fell to incredibly low 816 levels, disrupting farm life in almost every country of the world. In 1930, a bushel of wheat, in terms of gold, sold for the lowest price in 400 years. Worldwide agricultural depression. Wheat growers everywhere were faced with ruin. Growers of many other crops faced the same dismal prospect. Cotton and corn, coffee and cocoa all collapsed. Brazilian and African planters were caught by overproduction and falling prices. In Java, where the acreage in sugar had been extended and the unit yield from the sugarcane had also multiplied 10 times under scientific cultivation over the past century, prices bottomed out of the world market. The acute phase of the Great Depression, which began in 1929, was made worse by this chronic background of global agricultural distress because there was no reserve of purchasing power on the farms. The farmers' plight became even worse when city people, struck by depression in industry, cut down their expenditures for food. Agricultural depression, rather than industrial depression, was at the root of widespread troubles in the interwar years throughout Eastern Europe and the colonial world. 1434, the crash of 1929 and the spread of economic crisis. The Depression, in the strict sense, began as a stock market and financial crisis. Prices of stocks had been pushed upward by years of continuing expansion and high dividends. At the beginning of 1929, prices on the European stock exchanges began to weaken. But the real crisis, or global turning point, came with the crash on the New York Stock Exchange in October 1929. Here, values had been driven to fantastic heights by excessive speculation. Not only professional speculators, but quite ordinary people bought stock with borrowed funds. Often trading on margin, they owned 5 or 10 times as much stock as the amount of their own money put into it. The rest they borrowed from brokers, and the brokers borrowed from banks, the purchased stock in each case serving as collateral. With money so easy to obtain, people pushed up American stock prices by bidding against each other and enjoyed huge fortunes on paper. But if prices fell, even a little, the hapless owners would be obliged to sell their stock to pay off the money they had borrowed. Hence, the weakening of values on the New York Stock Exchange set off uncontrollable tidal waves of selling, which drove stock prices down irresistibly and disastrously. In a month, stock values dropped by 40%, and in 3 years, from 1929 to 1932, the average value of 50 industrial stocks traded on the New York Stock Exchange dropped from 252 to 61. In these same 3 years, 5,000 American banks closed their doors. The crisis passed from finance to industry, and from the United States into Europe and the rest of the world. The export of American capital came to an end. Americans not only ceased to invest in Europe, but sold the foreign securities that they had. This pulled the foundations from under the post-war revival of Germany, and hence indirectly of much of Europe. Americans, their incomes falling, ceased to buy foreign goods. People in Europe saw their American markets slip away, and prices tumbled. Everywhere business firms and private people could not collect what was owed them, or even draw on money that they thought they had in the bank. They could not buy, and so the factories could not sell. Factories slowed down or closed entirely. Between 1929 and 1932, the latter year representing the depth of the Depression, world production is estimated to have declined by 38%, and the world's international trade fell by 2/3. In the United States, national income fell from $85 billion to $37 billion. Economic crisis becomes global. Unemployment, a chronic disease ever since the Great War, assumed the proportion of a plague. In 1932, there were 30 million 1435 unemployed persons reported in the world, and this figure did not include the further millions who could find work only for a few hours in the week, or the masses in Asia or Africa for whom no statistics were reported. The workers' wages were gone, the farmer's income touched bottom, and the decline of mass purchasing power forced more idleness of machinery and more unemployment. People in the prime of life spent years out of work. Young people could not find jobs or establish themselves in an occupation. Skills and talents of older people grew rusty. Millions were reduced to living and supporting their families on the pittances of charity, doles, or relief. Great modern cities saw an outburst of sidewalk art, in which jobless, able-bodied men drew pictures on the pavement with colored chalk. in the hope of attracting a few sixpence or dimes. People were crushed in spirit by a feeling of uselessness. Months and years of fruitless job hunting left them demoralized, bored, embittered, and resentful. Never had there been such waste, not merely of machinery that now stood idle, but also of the trained and disciplined labor force on which all modern societies were built. And people chronically out of work turned to new and disturbing political ideas. Unemployment, 1436, political and economic reactions to the crisis. Optimists at the time, of whom President Herbert Hoover in the United States was one, declared that this depression, though a severe one, was basically only another periodic low point in the business cycle, or alternation of expansion and contraction, which had ebbed and flowed in the Western world for over a century. Prosperity, they blithely said, was just around the corner. Others came to believe that the crisis represented the breakdown of the whole system of capitalism and free private enterprise. These people, in many cases, looked for signs of the future in the planned economy then being introduced in the USSR. There was some truth in both views. After 1932, in part for purely cyclical reasons, because the Depression cut down indebtedness and reduced the costs of doing business, it again became possible to produce and sell. World steel production, for example, which had stood at 121 million tons in 1929 and then collapsed to 50 million in 1932, by 1936 again reached 122 million. To a considerable degree, to be sure, revival was due to rearmament, especially in Europe. On the other hand, the Great Depression did put an end to some aspects of the older free market economic system. Even if such a stricken economy had internal powers of full recuperation, people would not stand for such terrifying insecurity in their personal lives. The horrors of mass unemployment were long remembered. All governments took new steps to provide work and incomes for their people. All in one way or another strove to free themselves from dependency on the uncertainties of the world market. The interlocking world economy collapsed both from the Depression itself and from the measures adopted to cure it. One of the most marked economic consequences of the Depression was a strong movement toward economic nationalism, toward greater self-sufficiency within the sphere that each government could hope to control. The international trading systems that had developed through easy money exchanges, the gold standard, and the free convertibility of currencies gradually broke down. Countries specializing in agricultural exports were among the first to be pinched. Agricultural prices were so low that even a large quantity of exports failed to produce enough foreign currency to pay for needed imports. Hence, the exporting country's currency fell in value. The currencies of Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Australia, and New Zealand all depreciated in 1929 and 1930. Then came the turn of the industrial countries. England also, as the Depression went on, could not 18 sell enough exports to pay for imports. It had to pay for imports in part by sending gold out of the country. Thus, the gold reserves supporting the pound sterling declined, and people who had pound sterling began to convert their pounds into dollars or other currencies, for which they thought the gold basis was more secure. This was known, in the poetic 1437 language of economics, as the flight from the pound. In 1931, Great Britain went off the gold standard, which is to say that it devalued the pound. But after Britain devalued, some 20-odd other countries, to protect their own exports and their own industries, did the same. Hence, somewhat the same relative position reappeared. Even the United States, which possessed most of the world's gold supply, renounced the gold standard and devalued the dollar in 1934. The purpose was mainly to help American farmers. With dollars cheaper in terms of foreign currencies, foreigners could afford to buy more American agricultural products. But it became harder for Europeans and other foreigners to sell to the United States. Economic nationalism. Rising unemployment in Depression-era Britain led to widespread protests, such as this Hunger March. Unemployed workers demanded more access to the government assistance that helped impoverished people buy food. Keystone Holton Archive, Getty Images, 1438. Hence the Depression, adding its effects to those of the World War and post-war inflation, led to chaos in the international monetary exchanges. Governments manipulated 819 their currencies to uphold their sagging exports. Or they imposed exchange controls, which required that foreigners from whom their own people purchased and to whom they gave their own currency should use this currency to buy from them in return. Trade, which had been multilateral, became increasingly bilateral. Sometimes, notably in the relations between Germany and Eastern European countries in the 1930s, bilateralism degenerated into actual barter. The Germans would exchange a certain number of cameras with Yugoslavia in return for a certain number of pigs. In such cases, the very conception of a market disappeared. International Monetary Exchanges in Chaos, 1439. Currency control was one means of keeping one's own factories from idleness by holding or capturing export markets in time of depression. Another way of keeping one's own factories going was to shut out competitive imports by the old device of protective tariffs. The United States enacted the unprecedentedly high Hawley-Smoot tariff in 1930, which soon contributed to the further decline of international trade. Other countries, equally or more distressed, now could sell less to America and hence buy fewer American goods. Other countries likewise raised their own tariffs in the desperate hope of reserving national markets for their own people. Even Great Britain, citadel of free trade in the 19th century, turned to protectionism. It also revived and adopted Joseph Chamberlain's old idea of an imperial tariff union. In 1932, by the Ottawa Agreements, Britain and the British Dominions adopted a policy of lower tariffs against one another and higher tariffs against the rest of the world. Even tariffs were not always enough for economic nationalists. Quotas or quantitative restrictions were adopted in many nations. By this system, a government said in effect not merely that goods brought into the country must pay a high tariff duty, but that above a certain amount, no goods could be brought in at all. Increasingly, both importers and exporters worked under government licenses in order that a country's entire foreign trade could be centrally planned and managed. Quotas 1440. Thus, the world economy disintegrated into fiercely competing national economic systems. In the oceanic wreckage of the Great Depression, each state tried to create an island of economic security for its own people. Some efforts were made to break down the rising barriers. An International Monetary and Economic Conference, meeting in London in 1933, attempted to open the clogged channels of world trade. It ended in failure, as did attempts to stabilize the exchange rates of various currencies. Soon thereafter, the wartime allies defaulted on their post-war debt payments to the United States. Legislation in Congress then denied them the right to float bonds or obtain new loans in the American securities market. American actions thus reinforced economic nationalism. The era that had opened with Woodrow Wilson's dream of international economic cooperation was ending with an unprecedented intensification of economic rivalry and national self-centeredness. It was only one of the promises of the post-war world to be blasted by the Great Depression. Cultural reactions to the crisis. The effects of the economic crisis spread to the cultural and intellectual life of the 1930s. Responding to the despair and social dislocation of the masses of unemployed, artists and writers turned to describing painful social realities and committed themselves to political activism. All this was in contrast to the 1920s. The post-war decade had been a period of great achievement in what is generally called modernist art and literature. Painters projected disjointed, dreamlike scenes, 820, evoking their personal memories or disorienting personal experiences, and writers emphasized their own personal vision and the innermost lives of the characters whom they depicted. These writers were responsible for remarkable explorations of memory, time, and the internal workings of the human mind. The Irish writer James Joyce published his famous novel Ulysses, portraying the life and thoughts of its leading character during a single day in Dublin, contributing with it to a new literary fascination with interior monologues and stream of consciousness writing. The French novelist Marcel Proust also developed lengthy descriptions of personal and emotional experiences in his multi-volume Remembrance of Things Past, and the English writer Virginia Woolf examined the complex passage of time through the characters she created in novels such as To the Lighthouse. A generation of American writers, including Gertrude Stein and Ernest Hemingway, had even settled in Paris after the First World War to pursue experimental forms of literature and art. The political and social world by no means disappeared from modernist literature, but these writers were more concerned with exploring the inner complexities of human psychology, partly in response to the horrors of the First World War. Modernism 1441. The economic turmoil of the Great Depression caused social instabilities and disruptions throughout most of Europe and the world. These German women were receiving food from German soldiers at a soup kitchen in November 1931, but their experiences exemplified a wider social disorientation that reshaped personal lives and political cultures in all industrial countries during the global economic crisis. Popper photo, Getty Images. Now, under the harsh economic conditions of the 1930s, it became common to reject the literary exploration of psychological anxieties as inadequate or even as self-indulgent. A new kind of realist literature and a literature of political engagement won support from intellectuals in all industrial societies, especially among those who believed that the Great Depression had grown out of fundamental flaws and injustices in the capitalist economy. Some writers, like the French novelist André Gide, as well as some poets, artists, 821, 442, and filmmakers, temporarily embraced communism and praised the social experiments of the Soviet Union. Others simply decided that they should set aside the arcane language of the literary avant-garde and write about the social suffering among unemployed or impoverished workers. A new genre of proletarian literature came into being. Many of the American expatriates who had settled in Paris to pursue avant-garde art or literature returned to the United States in the early 1930s. As the American critic Malcolm Cowley noted in his Exile's Return, the new social problems called for new kinds of writing. Joyce's Ulysses was a classic modernist work of the 1920s, but the literary style of high modernism gave way to a new kind of social literature and nonfiction in the 1930s. A younger generation of socially conscious authors, such as the English writer George Orwell, published Depression-era books that focused on poverty and the economic realities of daily life. Describing his own encounters with impoverished living conditions in Down and Out in Paris and London, 1933, and The Road to Wigan Pier, 1937, Orwell emphasized the real-world, social experiences of people who struggled simply to survive. His themes and those elaborated by others expressed the social and cultural anxiety that affected Europeans of all social classes in the wake of the unprecedented economic crisis. Meanwhile, the anxiety that fostered a new literary and artistic realism also contributed in very different ways to the rise of an angry, polarizing political extremism, which was now attracting new support among disillusioned and displaced people in every part of Europe and the wider Atlantic world. In the 1920s, many people believed or hoped that despite the horrors of the World War, Europe could begin moving again toward material and political progress. In the 1930s, they began to fear that progress was a phantom and that Europe could relapse into barbarism and a new world war. The Great Depression ushered in the nightmare of the 1930s. Everywhere the demand was for security. Each nation tried to live insofar as possible within itself. Each regulated, controlled, guided, planned, and tried to rescue its own economic system, attempting to escape from the influence or unpredictable behavior of other countries. Within each country, the same search for security encouraged the advancement of the welfare state and social democracy. Where democratic institutions were strong and resilient, governments took steps to protect individuals against the ravages of unemployment and destitution and to help guard against future catastrophes. This political response to the economic crisis shaped new democratic social reforms in Northwestern Europe and in the United States, where President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal legislation brought numerous European-style social welfare policies into American society. On the other hand, where democratic governments were not well established or taken for granted, which was the case in many countries after the First World War, dictatorship spread rapidly as authoritarian political leaders claimed they could respond more efficiently to the economic problems of the 1930s. Democracy was said to be suited only to wealthy or prosperous countries. Unemployed people generally cared far more for economic help or for promises of economic help than for any theory of how persons wielding public power should be selected. The cry was for a leader, someone who would act, make decisions, get results, inspire confidence, and restore national pride. The Great Depression opened the way for unscrupulous and ambitious political adventurers, for dictators like Adolf Hitler in Germany, whose solution to all political and international problems, it turned out, was war. 823 1445 97. Trials and Adjustments of Democracy in Britain and France. British Politics, the 1920s and the Depression. Britain, like the United States, even in the troubles of the Depression, remained firmly attached to representative institutions and democratic principles. The Great Depression aggravated and intensified Britain's older economic difficulties. More dependent on overseas markets than any other people, the British until 1914 had managed to hold their lead, exporting industrial products and investment capital, selling insurance and other services, and importing foodstuffs. But in the years before 1914, the British had begun to lose markets because of the emergence of other economically aggressive industrial nations, the growth of tariff barriers, the development of indigenous textile and other industries in India and elsewhere in Asia, the competition of new textile products with British cottons and woolens, and the substitution of new sources of fuel for British coal. The losses were accelerated by the economic disruption of the First World War, the disappearance of many overseas investments, and the post-war disorganization and impoverishment of markets. The widespread rise in tariffs after the war and the customs barriers in the new small states of Europe also hurt British exports. After 1918, Britain lived in a world no longer dependent on or eager for its manufactures. Britain's historical primacy as the pioneer industrial country also became a handicap. Both labor and management had developed their ideas and methods under older conditions, and the more recently industrialized countries were using newer techniques and machinery. The net result of all this was that in the interwar years, even in times of relative prosperity for the rest of the world, Britain was in depression and suffered severely from unemployment. The unemployment insurance adopted in 1911 was called heavily into play. By 1921, over 2 million unemployed were receiving benefit payments, contemptuously called the dole by those who disliked it. Unemployment insurance, an expanded old age pension system, medical aid, government-subsidized housing, and other social welfare measures helped to relieve economic distress and to, for 1446, prevent any drastic decline in the living standards of British workers. The welfare state was already well established in Britain before the Labour Party took office after the Second World War. Unemployment insurance. The labor unions made a strenuous effort to retain wage gains and other concessions won in wartime. Industry, hard-pressed itself, resisted. This situation reached a climax in 1926 in the coal mining industry, which was in a particularly bad plight. Government subsidies had not helped, and even conservative investigators had recommended some form of amalgamation and public management. A strike by the coal miners led to a general strike, supported by the other British unions. About half of the 6 million organized workers in Britain left their jobs as a token of sympathy and solidarity. But the government declared a state of emergency and made use of military personnel and middle-class volunteers to take over essential services. The strike ended in failure, and even in a setback for the trade unions. They were put under stricter control by the Trades Disputes Act of 1927, which declared all general or sympathy strikes illegal and even forbade the unions from raising money for political purposes. After the election of 1922, the Labour Party displaced the Liberal Party as the second of the two great parties of the country and faced the Conservatives as the official opposition. The Labour Party, which 8/24/47 had been no more than a loose federation of trade union and socialist organizations before the war, tightened its organizational structure, promoted labor legislation, and, bridging the gap between the trade unionists and the socialists, committed itself to a program of socialism. But it was a program of gradualist, democratic socialism, operating through customary British parliamentary procedures, and hence able to gain the goodwill of large sections of the middle classes. The Labour Party. The British coal miners' strike in 1926 generated a massive general strike by sympathetic workers throughout Britain. These well-dressed engineers joined the strike and marched across London to show their solidarity with the miners. But the government soon responded to this broad-based labor action with legislation that made all such sympathy strikes illegal. G. Adams, Holton Archive, Getty Images. Twice, in 1924 and in 1929, Labor governed the country as part of a coalition government in which Ramsay MacDonald served as prime minister. In 1924, Labor demonstrated its moderation. It did no more than extend unemployment relief and inaugurate housing and public works projects. Indeed, it acted firmly in the face of strikes that broke out. But it aroused opposition when it gave diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union and pledged a loan to the Soviets for the purchase of British goods. Meanwhile, newspapers published the so-called Red, or Zinoviev, letter purporting to be secret instructions from the head of the Communist International for British labor groups to prepare for a communist uprising in Britain. The document's authenticity has never been established, but the Conservatives successfully exploited it in an election that restored their earlier governing majority. In the election of May 1929, however, Labor's representation almost doubled, and the Conservative representation dropped proportionately. MacDonald again became prime minister. The Wall Street crash and the 1448 worldwide. Depression came during this second period of Labor Party government. The effects of the Depression were quickly felt. Unemployment, which had hovered about the 1 million mark in 1929, soon approached 825, the 3 million figure. The government expended large sums to supplement the unemployment insurance payments, and the public debt began to grow. Alarmed by the mounting deficit, MacDonald made plans to introduce a severe retrenchment policy, even to the extent of reducing the dole payments. The Labour Party was outraged, and some of the Labour ministers in his cabinet refused to support him. Critics such as the British economist John Maynard Keynes argued that the government's deficit spending was in fact essential for economic recovery. Keynes had begun to put forward this view of government expenditures even before the Great Depression struck, and he would soon bring his theories together in his most famous book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, 1936. In this book and other writings, Keynes argued that if private investment funds were idle, government funds must be employed to encourage or stimulate economic activity and to increase purchasing power until such time as private funds flowed again. Governments should therefore get money into circulation and prime the pump of industrial production. According to Keynes and others who criticized MacDonald's policies, the British government should set aside old orthodoxies about the dangers of deficit financing, because such policies were actually the most direct and rapid method for preventing a more general collapse of the capitalist system. Keynes's ideas attracted the interest of some policymakers in other countries, including the United States, and later gained wide international influence. But MacDonald rejected the new economic theories and continued to promote austerity measures. He was read out of the Labour Party, along with those ministers who had gone along with him. MacDonald thereupon formed an all-party coalition cabinet known as the National Government, which in an election of 1931 won an overwhelming victory. But it was the Conservative members of the coalition who took a majority of the seats in Parliament. 1449 Theories of Keynes. The formation of the National Government. The National Government coped with the Depression chiefly along retrenchment lines. Under Ramsay MacDonald from 1931 to 1935, Stanley Baldwin to 1937, and Neville Chamberlain after 1937. In addition to retrenchment and budget balancing, the government encouraged industry to reorganize and rationalize production by providing low-interest loans. Mainly, the government concentrated on economic nationalist measures rather than on fundamental changes in the capitalist economic system. Despite some recovery from the depths of the Depression, none of the government's nationalist policies brought full recovery or full employment. Unemployment persisted until military conscription and a growing armament program absorbed the jobless through a kind of inadvertent Keynesian expansion of government expenditures. Britain and the Commonwealth, Imperial Relations 1450. To the older British Empire, India, the crown colonies, protectorates, and spheres of influence, the post-war settlement added a number of League of Nations mandates. British rule in its various forms extended after 1919 to almost 500 million people, a fourth of the Earth's population and land surface. It was principally in Palestine, Egypt, India, and Ireland that the British faced complex political or social problems and growing opposition to their imperial control. In Palestine, where Britain exercised a League of Nations mandate following the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, a bitter conflict developed as Jewish immigrants moved into the territory after 1919, at which time there had been a relatively small population of about 570,000 Muslims, 75,000 Christians, and 60,000 Jews. The emigration increased rapidly during the 1930s, when Jews were escaping from Nazism and the rising anti-Semitism in Europe. Arabs and Jews began to struggle with each other and with Britain for control of lands that both groups claimed on the basis of long ancestries and ancient religions, inflamed now by modern nationalisms. In Egypt, in 1922, Britain formally ended the protectorate it had established 40 years earlier. The British retained the right to station some troops on Egyptian territory. However, and many political questions, especially the status of Sudan, remained unresolved. In India, the agitation for national independence, as we have seen, grew more intense. In all of these areas, from the Middle East to South Asia, the British were unable or unwilling to make major changes in their imperial system until after the Second World War. In Ireland, however, the independence movement finally managed to establish a separate Irish state. The Irish question had disoriented English politics for 40 years. Home Rule, authorized by Parliament in 1914, had been deferred for the duration of the war. During the hostilities, the Irish nationalists even accepted German support and rose in rebellion against the British in 1916. The rebellion was suppressed, but after the war, the Irish nationalists, led by the Sinn Féin party, fought a small but savage war of independence against the British. In 1922, the British finally recognized the Irish Free State, granting it dominion status within the British Commonwealth. But the Protestants in Ulster, the northern counties of Ireland where Presbyterians of Scottish origin had lived for 3 centuries and where they comprised a majority of the population, insisted on remaining outside the new state. Despite the vehement dissatisfaction of Irish nationalists, Ulster continued to be part of what was now called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. In 1937, the Irish Free State affirmed its full sovereignty and took the name Eire. In 1949, it broke all ties with the British Commonwealth and renamed itself the Republic of Ireland. The Irish question, however, remained unsettled throughout the rest of the century and beyond, because Catholic activists in both Northern Ireland and the new Irish Republic agitated for the Irish annexation of Ulster. The conflict pitted Irish moderates against Irish extremists, the latter perpetrating assassinations, bombings, and other disturbances to further their cause of uniting all Ireland within the Irish 1451 Republic. The Protestants in Ulster, meanwhile, remained obdurate about retaining their own religious and cultural identity and maintaining their political affiliation with Britain. The Irish question. As for the Dominions, the political status of these areas of European settlement overseas was now more clearly defined than ever before. The white-controlled Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the Union of South Africa, had long pursued their own independent policies, even levying tariffs against British goods. They had all joined loyally with Great Britain in the First World War, but all were stirred by a nationalism of their own and desired their independence to be regularized and promulgated to the world. An imperial conference in 1926 defined Dominion status, which was then corroborated by the Statute of Westminster of 1931. The Dominions became legally equal with each other and with Great Britain. No act passed by the British Parliament would apply to a dominion except by the dominion's own consent. Despite independent policies in economic matters and even in foreign affairs, the bonds between the dominions and Britain remained firm. The support of the dominions in the Second World War was to be vital in Britain's survival. In the post war world, with decolonization, the Commonwealth became a larger, more heterogeneous, and even more flexible institution.